Sticking with the binge of indie titles we've been on lately, we have another interesting twist on the tower defense genre, this time with a bit more of an almost puzzle-style city builder aspect to it. Almost like a 3D version of the Kingdom games, since instead of simply choosing the highest damage tool available, you actually need to manage your economy, your army, and sometimes even fight the enemies yourself. Now, the key I received from the press agency after playing the demo is for the early access version of the title, which currently has only 4 levels, but don't let that fool you. There's actually a lot to do here, since each of the levels has an assortment of challenge missions for you to accomplish to finish them, so it is pretty rare that you'll be playing a level only once. And due to the nature of the challenges, you'll be having to adjust your building strategies pretty significantly to overcome the different boosts being given to the enemies, or different restrictions on your unlocks. I wager we will see plenty more areas like these in the future as well, and these first 4 regions do also set up a tempo that I would not be surprised to see mirrored as it works its way towards 1.0. Now, the reason why I called this a city builder is because you actually need to manage far more than just your towers, since the game wants you to build up homes, walls, barracks, and a plethora of other resource or defensive buildings with increasing variety as you move one stage to the next. And the reason for saying puzzle is because what you can build where is actually based on a peculiar format, where the locations for any given buildings are already determined by the map itself. The puzzle is building it in what order that balances your resources with your defenses. Do you spend that 3 gold on a tower or spend 2 on a house? Do you build the tower slot closer to your castle in case something leaks, or do you use the further away tower slot to kill it near the spawn? This is further amplified by how most of the buildings give you a choice in how they are modified for your specific run. The windmills, for example, naturally provide a bit of income, but they also have a design decision when you place them in a slot. Do you want that windmill you place to improve the gold income of farms even more? Do you want it to explode when destroyed, just taking enemies with it instead? Or would you rather it place scarecrows on the farms to shoot down flying enemies? And every slot outside of the houses, walls, and fishery have this multi-flavor system. Barracks and towers in particular even let you build around an almost rock, paper, scissors system, especially after you've unlocked all the flavors. Since if you need your infantry to counter fast enemies, you get the spearmen. If you need to deal with swarms of tiny enemies, the flails are the way to go. If you just need something tanky, then you go with the swordsman. Similar things for the archery ranges, and the towers can eventually evolve to being super durable or anti-siege weaponry, or even dumping hot oil on enemies surrounding them. Now, I personally really like this system, even if it does restrict me from being able to maze or even choose specific locations for towers, like I would in a traditional tower defense, since it lets you take an approach that is much more akin to designing a build for an RPG, rather than just stacking up swarms of ballista or cannons. This format also keeps you from going completely ham on resources and the like, so the challenge modes still remain challenging, especially when they restrict the enemy gold drop rates, forcing you to be much more selective about what buildings you decide to pick up, and which ones you decide to leave underdeveloped. Now, in addition to those challenges, you also unlock perks, and as you level up, you gain the ability to equip more and more perks as well to help you handle the tougher maps, and you will definitely want to level up a bit before the 4th map, so you have at least 2 or 3 perk slots unlocked, since it is a fairly challenging beast. These perks range from fairly basic stuff like your castle producing gold each turn to some rather interesting tweaks, such as turning your houses into short-range turrets, or increasing your soldiers' life immensely at the cost of increasing their spawn time by, well, a lot as well. And mixing and matching them for your challenges is extremely important, especially as you try for some of the more difficult combinations. Now, the last thing you have in your arsenal is actually yourself, the king. Basically, you are a fairly strong unit that will respawn after a few seconds if you die, and early on in each stage you will be fighting toe-to-toe with everything from soldiers to critters that are attacking your kingdom, and you will need to fight to actually beat some of the levels. And the king, like so many things in this game, is able to be given different weapons for the job, with the original weapon you have being a simple bow with a special slash attack for focusing down enemies. But eventually you will unlock a spear that lets you pull a Chun-Li with flurry of stabs, and heck, you'll even get a giant sword that lets you spin to win if you want. And weirdly, I found that even stage to stage, I was swapping weapons to deal with the specific challenges I would face. I think the only thing that I have to kind of nitpick about the king is actually a nitpick on the game as a whole, and that is a lack of rebindable controls. And the fact that having your king command troops to a location requires using the control key, which is a bit awkward since I'm a home row WASD user rather than a caps lock WASD user. And I would absolutely rebind this to either middle mouse or one of the surrounding letter keys. But this is a minor issue, since you aren't usually commanding units too often in the heat of battle. Back to the game though, obviously in both the tutorial stages as well as the first complex stage, you're going to be expected to use the starter gear, minimal perks, and fairly vanilla buildings. So the enemy paths in it are fairly limited, the build space is straightforward, and it's designed to ease you into the challenge with enemies mostly coming at you from the front, along with very little need to manage your troops short of actually spawning them in. As you move on to the next two regions though, things get a bit more complex. The desert region expecting you to learn about mine shafts for movement and using wave-to-wave troop positioning to handle the paths that happen to be fairly lacking when it comes to tower placements, while trusting your other defenses to hold while you're not there. This stage favors mobility much more than the first, and you're being attacked from all different directions, and even dealing with rolling bombs that will decimate troops and buildings, but hey, you don't have to deal with flyers here. That said, it is still beatable with minimal level ups or perks, you just have to stay on top of the various avenues of attack. That said, this was also the only level that I happened to find a glitch, with enemies finding their way around a wall where they probably shouldn't have been able to on the right side of the map, which I'm sure will get patched almost immediately. Though it does say something about the game that I put in over 6 hours into it, and even tried to break it a few times, and that was the only bug I found. Now, the fourth and final stage is your obligatory winter level, and weirdly I hope they keep the pattern these first stages introduced, since the fourth stage is a proper boss level, and having that pattern of a handful of exploring the region levels followed by a proper tough fight is an enjoyable and familiar pattern for me. This is reinforced by the fact that the design of the fourth level in and of itself provides challenge, since while the first two stages dealt with fairly basic enemies from mostly one direction, and the third level dealt with fast enemies from, well, all directions, the fourth level deals with enemies within your walls. Yes, even from the middle of your base. Though this placement itself is not in an unfair way, since the game does tell you where enemies are coming from each wave, and you do have the placements to actually deal with it. The challenge of this level though is that its enemies are centered around being proper swarm enemies, sort of reinforcing the rock, paper, scissors feature mentioned earlier, since this is the stage where you want an area of effect and a lot of sources of damage, or you'll quickly just get melted and overwhelmed. That said, I do think the early waves are a bit overtuned, but it's manageable, and they do foreshadow that you need to be building towards this for later waves. And while most of the stages took me 1, maybe 2 tries to get my first victory on, this one actually took me 4 tries to get the strategy down, especially the boss fight. Though, thanks to good game design and the boss being on a proper pattern, I was eventually able to get it down and arrange my units in a way that made it doable, even if still a fairly decent challenge. And honestly, I look forward to seeing what they do with future levels as well as bosses in the game, and even additional perks and challenges that they'll introduce along the way. This is, oddly enough, despite its simplicity, probably one of my favorite games I've covered this year, even if it does only have about 4 to 10 hours of content currently. It's got a really solid balance of complexity and accessibility that makes me want to continue playing more of it. So do you like the looks of Thronefall in all its isometric kingdom glory, or are you looking for something a bit more complex in your tower defense games? If so, you might like the game on screen now, and if you want to see this ad-free, check out the Patreon down below.